The United States military issued a machine gun so destructive that soldiers in the field gave it a nickname that had nothing to do with power or speed or dominance. They called it the Pig. Not because it was impressive, because it was heavy, temperamental, and it ate everything you fed it and still found a way to make your life miserable. Then Hollywood got hold of it, stripped 40 pounds of reality off the thing, handed it to Sylvester Stallone, and convinced an entire generation that one man could carry it through a jungle with one hand. Hi, my name is Chris, and this is Movie Guns. The M60, what it actually is. The M60 is a belt-fed, gas-operated, air-cooled, general-purpose machine gun, chambered in 7.62 by 51mm NATO. If those numbers mean nothing to you, here's the version that does. The bullet it fires is roughly the same round used in most military sniper rifles. Not the intermediate cartridge your modern assault rifle runs. Full power rifle ammunition, fed continuously from a disintegrating metal belt, fired at a cyclic rate of between 500 and 650 rounds per minute, depending on the variant. The gun itself weighs 23.1 pounds unloaded. That is before you attach the bipod and before you add a single round of ammunition. A standard 100-round belt of 7.62 NATO weighs approximately 6.5 pounds on its own. So, a gunner walking into a firefight with 300 rounds of linked ammunition is carrying roughly 43 pounds of weapon and ammunition alone. The barrel runs 22 inches and the overall length of the weapon sits at 43.5 inches. You are essentially carrying a piece of furniture into combat. Furniture that fires rifle rounds fast enough to cut a tree in half if you hold the trigger long enough. The muzzle velocity on a standard NATO load clocks in at around 2,800 feet per second. The muzzle energy sits north of 2,500 foot-pounds. For reference, the round Dirty Harry's Model 29 fired generated around 750 foot-pounds at 50 yards. The M60 round hits with more than 3 times that energy. Every single shot, continuously, up to 650 times per minute. That is what Sylvester Stallone supposedly carried through a Vietnamese jungle while firing from the hip with one hand. The history behind the machine gun. The M60 entered United States military service in 1957, replacing the older M1918 Browning automatic rifle and the M1919 A6 medium machine gun. The Army needed a single weapon that could fill multiple roles, a light machine gun that a squad could carry, and a medium machine gun that could anchor a defensive position. The M60 was supposed to do both. It did both, badly and magnificently, often in the same firefight. By the time American ground forces were operating in significant numbers in Vietnam in the mid-1960s, the M60 was everywhere. Every infantry squad was supposed to have at least one. The designated gunner carried the weapon. An assistant gunner carried additional ammunition belts and a spare barrel because the M60's barrel overheated fast under sustained fire and needed to be swapped out mid-engagement using a special asbestos glove. If you lost your assistant gunner, you either burned through your barrel and jammed your weapon, or you burned your hand, changing it bare. Neither option was good. Veterans who carried the M60 in Vietnam did not describe the experience the way the movies do. They described exhaustion. The gun was supposed to weigh 23 pounds. After 6 hours of humping through triple canopy jungle in 100-degree heat and 90% humidity, 23 pounds feels like 60. Soldiers were called, rotating the carry between multiple men in a squad just to keep everyone functional. And then the nickname arrived, the Pig. Grunts called it the Pig because it was heavy, and it was dirty, and it was mean, and it ate constantly, and it still found ways to malfunction at the worst possible moment. The M60 had a feed tray that loved to jam when mud or debris got into the mechanism. The gas system was sensitive to fouling. The bipod legs had a habit of folding at inconvenient times. But here's the thing about the Pig that the men who carried it never forgot. When it worked, and it usually worked, nothing on the other side of the jungle felt safe. A well-trained M60 gunner, laying down suppressing fire, could keep an entire enemy force pinned behind cover. The sound alone, that distinctive throaty chatter at around 550 rounds per minute, was different enough from an M16 that enemy fighters learned to recognize it and treat it as a serious threat. The gun had a presence on the battlefield that lighter weapons simply could not match. That presence is what the Rambo films borrowed, just the presence. Everything else got quietly set aside. What Hollywood did to it. Peter McDonald directed First Blood, and the production faced a problem that every action film faces when it decides the hero needs to wield a weapon that is physically impossible for one person to operate the way the script describes. The M60 as issued weighed 23 pounds. That weight existed for a reason. The mass of the receiver helped manage recoil from a cartridge that generates significant rearward force with every shot. Remove that mass and you have a lighter gun that moves dramatically more under fire and becomes dramatically harder to control. The production modified the M60 for Stallone. The most significant change was the removal of the barrel jacket and bipod assembly, which shed meaningful weight and gave the weapon the sleeker silhouette you see on screen. They also shortened components and stripped parts that added to the overall profile. The finished screen weapon looked like an M60, the way a sports car looks like a truck. Same basic DNA. Completely different animal. And then there is the one-handed firing. In the film's most iconic sequences, Rambo fires the M60 from the hip, one-handed, while doing other things with his free hand. The recoil from a standard 7.62 NATO round in a weapon this size would, under real conditions, make that physically impossible to sustain for more than a fraction of a second before the muzzle climbed entirely off target. I want you to think about a garden hose at full pressure. Now, imagine the hose weighs 23 pounds and instead of water, it is throwing rifle rounds. That is roughly the control problem you are dealing with. Real M60 gunners fired from the bipod whenever possible. When they fired standing, they used both hands, braced the stock against the hip, and leaned into the weapon. Sustained accurate fire from a standing unsupported position was a trained skill that took significant upper body strength and practice to maintain even briefly. Stallone is not a small man, and he was in extraordinary physical condition for First Blood Part 2. But no amount of conditioning changes the physics of what a belt-fed machine gun does when you fire it with one hand like a handgun. The screen version of that moment is a visual argument, not a physical one. And here is the thing. It works completely. You absolutely believe it in the moment. That is the specific genius of the way that sequence was shot and cut. Your brain accepts the image because the image is so committed to itself. The ammunition belt deserves its own mention here. The long looping belt of linked ammunition that hangs off the M60 in Rambo is one of the most visually distinctive elements of the character's whole look. That belt in a real combat situation would be managed by the assistant gunner, fed carefully into the weapon to prevent kinks or tangles that could cause a stoppage. Running a loose belt through jungle terrain while firing from the hip is a reliable way to jam your weapon inside of 20 rounds. The film knows this does not matter. The belt is not there for function. It is there because it communicates something to the audience about scale and lethality that no amount of dialogue could deliver as fast. Stallone's physical preparation. Sylvester Stallone arrived at the production of First Blood Part 2 in a physical condition that genuinely disturbed some of the people around him. He was carrying approximately 168 pounds of muscle on his 5'9" frame, which required a diet and training regimen that he described in interviews as borderline inhuman. He trained for months before filming, focusing specifically on the kind of functional strength needed to make the M60 sequences look credible on camera. His daily diet during preparation reportedly consisted of a tiny amount of oatmeal cookies and a can of tuna per day. I want to say that again because I still cannot believe it. Oatmeal cookies, tuna, that was the menu. The man ate like a man who had lost a bet and just kept losing it every morning. The physical training included extensive work with the actual weapon, or as close to the actual weapon as the production could provide in a modified form. Stallone worked with weapons handlers until the movements looked natural on camera, transitions it between positions, and manages the belt during movement sequences. That work shows. The handling in the film does not look like an actor pretending to use a gun. It looks like someone who has spent considerable time with that specific weapon in his hands. The film shot primarily in Mexico, standing in for Vietnam, and the conditions were genuinely punishing. Stallone reportedly sustained injuries significant enough to require treatment during the shoot. Nobody making First Blood Part 2 was going through the motions. The gun's real combat record. The M60 served in Vietnam from the early 1960s through the end of American involvement in 1975, and the documented accounts of its use in combat tell a story that is simultaneously more impressive and more complicated than anything the Rambo films suggested. At the Battle of Ia Drang Valley in November 1965, one of the first major engagements between American forces and North Vietnamese Army regulars, M60 gunners were credited with providing the sustained suppressing fire that allowed surrounded American units to hold their positions long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The gun's ability to deliver continuous fire at rifle caliber was genuinely decisive in close terrain fighting. Veterans of that battle described the sound of M60's firing as the sound of survival. But the gun's limitations showed up just as clearly in the record. Barrel changes under fire were a documented problem throughout the war. The recommended barrel change interval under sustained fire was every 2 to 3 minutes of continuous firing. In a firefight that lasted 20 minutes, a single gunner might need to change the barrel 6 or 7 times. Barrel changes take 10 to 15 seconds, with a trained crew operating smoothly. Under fire, taking 10 to 15 seconds to perform a mechanical task with your hands is a very long time. The feed system jammed in wet and muddy conditions that describe most of Vietnam most of the time. Soldiers developed field expedient solutions, additional cleaning, modified carrying methods, improvised covers for the feed tray. None of those solutions appear in the film. None of them would have survived contact with the visual language the Rambo franchise was building. What the film borrowed from the real combat record was the EM60's reputation as a weapon that fundamentally changed the threat level of whoever was carrying it. That part was accurate. One man with an M60 was worth multiple men with rifles in terms of the suppressing fire he could generate. The film took that tactical reality and scaled it up until one man with an M60 was worth an entire army. The distance between those two things is where the myth lives. The cultural aftermath. First Blood, Part 2, opened in May 1985 and grossed over $300 million worldwide against a production budget of approximately $25 million. The film did not just make money. It restructured the visual language of the action genre for the next decade, and it permanently rewrote the public image of the M60 machine gun. Before Rambo, the M60 was a military weapon with a Vietnam War association. After Rambo, it was a symbol, one man, jungle, machine gun. That image compressed something complicated and painful about the Vietnam era into a single satisfying visual that audiences responded to on a level that had very little to do with firearms and almost everything to do with the cultural mood of 1985, America. Gun shows across the country reported increased interest in semi-automatic replicas and decommissioned military weapons in the M60 family following the film's release. Replica manufacturers started producing M60-style props and airsoft versions specifically referencing the Rambo visual. The specific configuration Stallone carried, stripped down, shortened, with the long ammunition belt, became the defining image of the weapon for an entire generation who had never been within 100 miles of a real one. Smith & Wesson did not make the M60. General Electric did not make the M60. Sako Defense and Sako, Maine manufactured the original and watched their weapon become globally famous in a form that bore limited relationship to the actual product they had built for the United States military. That is a specific kind of strange that only Hollywood produces. The myth versus the machine. The M60 that John Rambo carried through First Blood Part 2 was not the M60 that American soldiers carried through Vietnam. The weight was wrong. The operation was wrong. The one-handed sustained fire was wrong. The belt management was wrong. Nearly every physical detail of how the weapon was used on screen contradicted how the weapon was actually used in the field. And none of that matters even slightly to the film's power, because the film was never making an argument about machine gun operation. It was making an argument about a man, a specific kind of man, damaged, discarded, and still capable of more violence than the people who discarded him could comprehend. The M60 was the physical shape of that argument. The same way Doc Holliday's matched pair of nickel Colts communicated character before a single line of dialogue, Rambo's M60 communicated something about John Rambo that the script spent the entire film trying to say in words. The real M60 was a squad weapon, heavy, crew-served, dependent on teamwork and logistics and spare barrels and assistant gunners and careful ammunitions management. The movie M60 was a solo instrument, one man's extension. That transformation from squad asset to individual weapon is the lie the film needed to tell, and it told it so completely that the lie became the truth everyone remembers. The soldiers who actually carried the pig through the mud and heat of Vietnam knew the difference. Most of them never said a word about it publicly. A few of them watched the film and laughed. A few more watched it and felt something considerably more complicated. The gun the movie gave you was brutal enough. The gun the history books describe was something else entirely. The M60 earned its reputation in the worst possible classroom. Jungle heat, monsoon mud, contact at close range, and the specific terror of a trigger that would not stop until the belt ran empty or the barrel cooked itself to failure. Hollywood took that reputation, stripped the weight off it, put it in one man's hands, and sold it back to the world at $300 million worldwide. That is not a criticism. That is exactly what films are supposed to do. They take something real and make it mean something larger than itself. The M60 in First Blood Part 2 means something. It just does not mean what most people think it means. If you want to see another iconic movie weapon pulled apart down to the last mechanical detail and put back together in a way that changes how you watch the film, hit subscribe, and that next video is sitting right there, waiting for you. I am Chris. This is Movie Guns. And the pig deserved better than one man and a loincloth. Although, the loincloth did become iconic in its own right, so maybe everyone won.